It is the appraiser, not the agent, not the buyer, not the borrower, not the seller, not the friend, not the client, not the underwriter, not even Fannie Mae, that ultimately decides the scope of work.
Originating from deep inside the Rocky Mountains, transported through the power of the internet, and arriving inside your tiny earbuds. It's the Appraiser Coach Podcast.
Minisode.
If you've been in appraising more than just a few years, you've had the experience, especially if you're doing lender work, you've had the experience of turning in the report and then very quickly, within a day or two, getting a quote-unquote revision request, which gives you, quote-unquote, 4 new comparables that they want you to consider. What's up with this? I want to explore that today. I want to pause here and remind you that we are sponsored by ANOW software. ANOW, of course, is the software that I've been using to monitor, manage, take care of, and get great information from regarding my appraisal business. You can too. Go to anow.com. It's ANOW.com for more information. All right, folks, this happens on all too frequent basis where we get done with our appraisal. And let's face it, let's talk through this process, folks. When we do an appraisal, we're not just choosing the first 3 comps that come up on our screen and throwing them in there and making adjustments. And by the way, I want to talk about this term comps as well. Hopefully I'll remember to circle back to that. This idea that we throw in the quote-unquote comps, make the adjustments, and that is now a static appraisal report is just silly. The bottom line is there is a lot that goes into an appraisal, standard 1, before you ever get to standard 2, the report. Unfortunately, our clients only see standard 2. They only see the report because obviously that's the product that we deliver. But what we don't deliver is what's in our work file. What we don't deliver is the blood, sweat, and tears that go into creating the opinions and the analysis that we report on the appraisal report. And I think all too often, sometimes underwriters get in this mindset that they look at, hundreds of appraisals every day, and they are used to seeing a certain thing. And I don't know if they need to justify their job or what, but they come back with sometimes, let's face it, some silly requests. And one of my pet peeves is when they come back and they ask, in fact, let's just talk, I told you I'd circle back to this. Let's just talk about this term right now. When they come back and they ask for us to consider these comps, or when we're in the appraisal inspection and maybe we're there with an agent, and at the end, he or she says, now I took the liberty of pulling some comps for you. Here they are. Folks, and we've talked about it on this program before. In fact, go back in the archive and just search for the term comps or comparables, and you'll find we did a whole episode on terminology and how words matter. And this idea that they hand us a stack of papers that have printouts of sales, I'm going to focus on that word for a second, of sales in the neighborhood, but yet they call them comps. And I understand what they're doing, and they don't know better. I'm not blaming them, but it is frustrating because an agent, an underwriter, heaven forbid, somebody who has a biased position in this transaction, this loan, doesn't have the ability to decide whether or not these are comps. That's the appraiser's job. The appraiser is to look at the sales. The appraiser is to consider, according to USPAP, all comparables, okay? And this idea that we haven't already, if they truly were comparable, these sales that they're giving us and saying, please, consider them, they've got to know we already did, or they're so far out of the realm of compatibility that they weren't considered. They didn't even come up in our search because they're bigger, they're smaller, they're older, they're different quality construction. Maybe they're in a neighborhood that's non-competing. Folks, the reason for this mini-sode today is I just barely got off the phone with a lovely lady, and I don't say that sarcastically. She really was. She was a true gem, and she is from an AMC that you would recognize the name of. It's a very big AMC that I do not a lot of work for, but some work for. And I've been going back and forth with this lovely gal for the last couple of days regarding an appraisal that I completed recently that I felt pretty darn good about. This is not one of those that had subjective adjustments, that had large adjustments, that had, a large percentage of adjustments, that had single line adjustments. I mean, sometimes in the rural communities that I work, I have to do a whole lot of explaining on why I do what I do, because what I do is not typical for an appraisal product across the nation. I live in a very unique area. I sometimes appraise in areas that literally have 2 sales in the last 12 months in the entire 10-mile radius. That is not an exaggeration. And thus I need to explain why I do what I do and why I choose to put certain sales in and why I choose to omit other sales. And I over the years, I mean, I've been doing this 24 years. Over the years, I found ways to do it in such a way that it can be professional, that it can be well thought out, that I feel like I'm putting in a reliable appraisal, that the data that I've collected is credible, that I'm doing my job according to USPAP and state law and my own ethics and morals, and of course the legality of things as well. I feel like I do a darn good job. I do, if I do say so myself. Now, maybe somebody reviewing my work may not feel that way, but I certainly feel like the products that we turn in are well thought through, that they're well explained, and that we try to, as much as possible, remain unbiased through the workflow. Well, the concern here, of course, is when a client comes and says, hey, we want you to consider these sales. And frankly, it doesn't really bother me that much, even when they use the word comparables. I get it. I understand where they're coming from. They're using the terminology that they know. But underwriters, if you listen to this, and I know a few of you do, please be careful. These emails need to be worded very, very carefully, because there are implications when you use certain terms. Words matter. And when you say, please consider these comparables, you are already jumping to the conclusion that they truly are comparable to the subject. And maybe you think, well, duh, Dustin, look at them. I mean, same size, same shape. Heck, it's the same color. I can see that from the MLS photos. Folks, remember why it is that you hire appraisers. I mean, truly, if it were that easy, and I don't mean to speak down, but if it were that easy, you could use AVMs. It's not that easy. I will testify it's not that easy. There's a reason that appraisers are professionals, and there's a reason that Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, FHA, VA, and the like continue to come and require an appraisal be done. Because there are situations that need to be looked at by a human being, number one, but number two, somebody who understands and gets it. Somebody who truly understands what analysis looks like and understands the market and lives here and has worked here and understands that you might have an identical, for all intents and purposes, square foot, year built, style, lot size, quality, condition that may be across the road from one another, yet there could be some differences in location. There could be some differences in a non-competing neighborhood. And that's why we pay, that's why we hire, that's why we trust, and we should, appraisers. And I was talking to this lovely lady from the AMC. And at this point, you get back and forth, you go back and forth, go back and forth, go back and forth. Finally, you pick up the phone. And that's what I did. I picked up the phone and talked to her. And we had a lovely conversation. In fact, at one point in the conversation, I said, she apologized for all the back and forth. I said, hey, don't apologize. You seem like somebody that I'd love to hang out with on the weekend. You're just a nice person, a professional person. I felt like she validated me. I felt like she understood me. But yet she's kind of in a rough situation. She's in a position where she stands between the appraiser and the lender. The lender is absolutely stomping his or her foot, demanding that the appraiser does something that I frankly don't really feel comfortable about. I'll tell you one thing I do feel comfortable about, though, and that is using and telling you about ANow software. ANow, folks, helps me keep track of these revision requests. Did you know they have a revision request feature? Meaning when you get a revision, you can mark it as a revision, you can put it in the notes, and when you get it taken care of, you can unmark it. Well, why would you do that, Dustin? Well, two reasons. Number one, it helps you stay on track of those revisions. We like to get them done very, very quickly. We find that helps us in the eyes of our clients to get more work down the road if we're quick to respond. And number two, it allows me analytical analysis and data to look at and say, you know what? 1 in 3 reports come back for revisions, and now we're up to 2 in 3 reports are coming back for revisions. What's going on? What's happening? And as a business owner, I need that information to help me to be able to make better decisions. Folks, if you're not using ANow software, I don't know what you're using, but I guarantee it is inferior to what ANow can do for you. You can check them out right now. By the way, this is a company across the country. It does not matter your geographical area. It will work for you. It doesn't matter your setup, 1 person or 20 appraisers in your office. This will work for you, and it will be a great blessing to your life and to your business. ANow.com is where you find out more. ANOW.com. Welcome back to the program, everyone. Dustin Harris hanging out with you and talking about I literally got off the phone about 30 seconds before I turned on the microphone and decided to record this podcast, because I think this is a common thing that appraisers deal with on a pretty regular basis, frankly. All too frequently, if you ask me, where we get done with our appraisal, we get done with our report, maybe there's 30 sales that we considered, but for one reason or another, we boiled that down to 3 or 4 sales that we felt were the most comparable to the property, the ones that we felt bracketed the standard things that Fannie likes to see bracketed. Maybe we threw in 1 or 2 active listings there to show the law of substitution, to show what else is on the market, to help give credibility to the report. And then a day, maybe 2 days later, we get a request from the AMC typically saying, hey, could you please consider these 4 sales? Or typically what they say is for comparables. We've already talked about that term comparable and what it takes to become a comparable. So again, underwriters, be careful in your terminology. Trust me, appraisers are going to take your request much more seriously if you use the right terms. And the right term here is sales. Please consider these sales. Let the appraiser determine whether or not it's a comparable. But the bottom line is most of the time I will look at these, and I would say, 50% of the time, they might have one or two sales that I look at and say, yeah, you know what? I've already got 4 comps in the report. I don't mind putting 1 or 2 more in, help the scope of work along. Again, scope of work is the decision of the appraiser. Okay, I want to make that clear. There's nothing wrong with an underwriter making a suggestion. But in the end, and today's example, and I'm going to share with you more of the story, today's example, in my opinion, is a perfect example of an appraiser deciding ultimately what the scope of work is. And that's what USPAP says. There's nothing wrong with collaborating with realtors, with lenders, with buyers, with sellers on suggestions. There's nothing wrong with being in a home and a borrower pointing across the road and making a suggestion that, hey, my neighbor's house just sold for $400,000 and it's a little bit less, in size than mine. Would you use that sale? Nothing wrong with the ask, okay? Now, typically what I'll say in those situations, because nobody wants to get into a lot of inside baseball and technical terms, what I might say to them, hey, I'll consider it. I'll take a peek and see what's on the MLS, right? By the way, I'm a non-disclosure state, so that really is the only source of data for us. But certainly I'll look at it, right? But in the end, it's up to me, the appraiser, to decide whether or not to use and include that particular sale, if it truly exists. A lot of times I find people say, hey, my neighbor's house just sold for $400,000. It's slightly smaller than mine, and then I pull up the MLS. And first of all, it sold for $350. It was listed for $400, but it sold for $350. And by the way, it is inferior or superior in this, that, and the other. So much so that it wouldn't even be considered a comp. And that's really what we're talking about today. What is a comp, right? And at what point do you have to dig your deals in a little bit? I can tell you that sometimes I do include them in the grid, just to give a little bit more support and say, okay, I included 123 Any Street and 456 Oak Street, and after adjustments, they actually support, what my original report looked like. And that's okay. I don't see that there's a problem with that if, as the appraiser, I make the decision to amend my scope of work. But then there's the times that typically happen, and I would say at least 50% of the time, the quote-unquote comps that they send me or the sales that they send me truly are just not comparable, and they certainly aren't anywhere close to as comparable as the 3 or 4 that I already included. Remember, I've already done my analysis, and I've already eliminated quite a few sales that I never included in the grid to begin with. And so often when they come back and they say, hey, would you consider these comps, they say, but they're really trying to say sales, I look at them and I simply write an addendum and say the client has asked that I consider 123 Any Street, 456 Oak Street, 78910 Spruce Street, and 101112 Elm Street. And then I go through and in detail, I explain why I did not grid them out and why I did not use them in the appraisal. And that's what I did on this particular report. We went back and forth on email more than a half dozen times, back and forth, to where they finally said, and I'm just going to quote, well, you know what, for terms of for reasons of confidentiality, I'm just going to paraphrase. But basically they said, you will grid these out and make adjustments like you did in the original report and turn it back into us. I mean, that was the gist of it. Was not a question. It was a demand. Now, to their credit, they did offer to pay me for my time. They said, if this is going to cost us more money, we're willing to pay more for this increased scope of work. But folks, here's the problem. I had already gone through each of the sales one by one. Out of a courtesy to my client, out of professionalism to my client, I went through one by one and determined that, number one, they were not comparable, and number two, why they were not comparable, and I wrote a short paragraph on each one. 123 Elm Street was not considered because it was across a major dividing line in a non-competing neighborhood. It had superior stucco on the outside, was 250 square foot larger in GLA, had an unfinished basement, and was not considered comparable to the subject. Things like that. And then I went through one by one and described them. Well, here's the problem. Here's my concern. And by the way, I would love to hear your comments on this. If I'm out of line, let me know I'm out of line. If I'm using a chip on my shoulder and the pride I hold in my heart as a real estate appraiser to make an argument that is not accurate, I would love to hear that. I'm serious. I'm not being sarcastic. Let me know if I'm wrong in this situation. But folks, here's where I come down on this. When a client, first of all, demands a scope of work that is outside my comfort level, I have not only a duty not to comply, but a duty to make sure that I stand on my principles. Remember, it is the appraiser and not the client that ultimately determines the scope of work. Let me repeat that. It is the appraiser, not the agent, not the buyer, not the borrower, not the seller, not the friend, not the client, not the underwriter, not even Fannie Mae, that ultimately decides the scope of work. Now, we as appraisers get quote unquote told what to do all the time, but it ultimately has to be our decision whether or not we're going to comply with those instructions. And if we feel that by doing so, it puts us in jeopardy, we have a duty to back off and say, in a professional manner, by the way, we don't need to get snotty and snooty here with our clients, but in a professional manner, we have to say thanks, but no thanks. And here's why. And I'll tell you my description, my understanding of USPAP, my understanding of this scope of work. When they demanded that I put them in the grid, this was my answer. And by the way, this was the point that I picked up the phone and called the lovely receptionist. And by the way, she was trained in appraisal. She said she'd been doing appraisals for 20 years. She spoke my language. It was great. It actually was a very, very nice and somewhat surprising conversation. It wasn't what I planned on when I picked up the phone. But in the end, she agreed with me, and she and I had a talk. And I said, listen, if I put these sales, and I'm going to use that term deliberately, in the grid, the Fannie Mae form itself does not use the words sale 1, sale 2, sale 3, and so on. The grid itself says comparable 1, comparable 2, comparable 3. And even if I put them after the active listings as comparable 7, 8, and 9, I'm still, as an appraiser, admitting that they're comparable. By putting them in the grid, I am saying that they are comparable because that's what the title of each of those grid lines is. Comparable 7, comparable 8, comparable 9. And her question was, well, could you put them in and then describe where they're not comparable? And I said, no. And here's why. Because it's a dichotomy. Because on one hand, I'm saying it's a comparable 7, comparable 8, comparable 9, and later on in the addendum, I'm saying, oh, by the way, they're not comparable. I just threw them in for practice purposes. I mean, what reason would you possibly give? It can't be because the client told me to, because let's face it, we as the appraiser determine the scope of work. Now, in the end, and again, kudos to this great company. Maybe I should shout them out, but I won't, because they hired a good one. This receptionist, this gal, I don't know what to call her. I don't know if she had an appraisal license, but she certainly was pleasant to talk to. She understood. She's going to go back to the client. I don't know where this is going to end. Hopefully, it will die at this point. But to her credit, she understood where I was coming from. Folks, here's the thing. When you are asked by your client to do a certain thing, and when you are asked to do a thing that you don't feel comfortable with, it is your duty as a professional to, in a professional manner, okay, we're not talking about flipping them off. We're not talking about cursing at them. We're not talking about them to go to hell, okay? You don't need to go there. In a professional manner, it is your duty to explain, thank you for the request. I appreciate where you're coming from. I can understand what you need here, but here's the problem. And I just can't do it, and here's why. Folks, the more we do that, the more kudos we give to our profession as real estate appraisers, the more we testify of our need and stand up for the reason real estate appraisers exist. Speaking of existing as real estate appraisers, are you interested in becoming an appraiser? Are you not an appraiser and need a mentor? Are you a trainee? Are you a trainee and want to start out on the right foot? Folks, I have some great news for you. And that is, we just came out with our brand new course. This is awesome, folks. It is a trainee course all about how to become a real estate trainee and how to get a mentor. For those of you who have struggled, I have some ideas that I promise you will help. I promise you that you will get a mentor after going through this course if you follow the steps in the course. It will absolutely happen. And by the way, you can get $100 off this course right now if you use the code TRAINEE100. It's all caps, no spaces, no underscores, trainee, TRAINEE 100, the number 100, trainee 100 right now.
You've been listening to the Appraiser Coach podcast with Dustin Harris. If you like what you hear, please give us a 5-star rating and post a short review on iTunes. For more in-depth insider information on how you can make more money as a real estate appraiser, visit theappraisercoach.com and sign up for the All-Star team today. Thanks for joining us. And now, get out there and create some value.